Hello, welcome back to episode 3 of the Magic Hour. This week's episode is a really interesting one. We're talking about something a little bit more controversial. We're going to be talking about ethics and stem cells. We're also going to touch on vegan activism as well and how that ties into the conversation. Joining me as usual, we have got Professor Andrew Laslett, our head of R&D, and we've also got a special guest today, Andrew.
Yes, we do. And if you don't know who that voice was, that's our CEO and founder, Paul Bevan. And sitting to my left is my good friend, for I'm not going to say how many decades, but Professor Megan Munsie. So she has 2 appointments. She's 50% at the Murdoch Children's Research Institute, where she's a group leader in stem cells and ethics. And she's also a professor of emerging technologies at the University of Melbourne Medical School. And just to keep herself a little bit busy, she's also the president of the Australian Society for Stem Cell Research. So we're really super grateful for you coming on to chat on a relatively new topic for you, I think, cultivated meat and cellular agriculture. But I'm really interested in see where this chat goes in terms of the ethics in and around cultivated meat.
Well, thanks very much for the invitation. I'm delighted to join the conversation, and I think it's an important one that we should start thinking about. And it's certainly an area I've been thinking about for a couple of years now. I've been watching how the field's developing, and you're right. I mainly am interested in how stem cells are being applied in medicine and could be applied in medicine, and perhaps some of the hype and misunderstanding. So your podcast last time, the second episode on sort of demystifying the science, is right up my alley, because I think, a lot of my work is anchored around what people think perhaps we do in labs and what we actually do. And I think that's a really important conversation to keep coming back to.
Fantastic. Does that mean you actually listen to our podcast?
I've listened to both.
Fabulous.
And I've learned a lot about both of you. Even things I didn't know about Andy, that I've known him for, I think it's our 30th anniversary next year.
Yes, we met when we were both doing postgraduate study at Monash University.
That's right.
A little while ago. Excellent.
Megan, do you want to tell us and the listeners a little bit about your background in stem cell research and how you got to that point, or particularly your interest in the ethics side of things as well?
Yeah, sure. So, I suppose I should start at the beginning and say that I'm a scientist by training. So I did my undergraduate up in Queensland at QUT, and always loved science. Wanted to work in a lab, very interested in cells, very interested in biology. And I was doing my undergraduate in pathology science, and it became very clear to me that it was going to be quite automated and that there wasn't a lot of sciencing happening. There's a lot of processing happening, and that wasn't really going to be the space for me. And as I was finishing my undergraduate degree, I got offered a job as an embryologist in an IVF clinic. So I really started my science as a scientist in an IVF clinic. I worked in that area for 10 years, did my master's part-time, and that's where I met Andy at Monash, moved to Melbourne from Queensland. So I think you've got a Queensland connection too.
I do.
I'll talk about that later. So I moved down to Melbourne, did my studies, and while I was finishing my master's, I had no intention of going back and doing any further postgraduate studies, didn't really want to do a PhD, didn't really know much about a PhD. But I got offered a scholarship, and it was on this really cool topic, and it just really interested me because I was aware of stem cells, but not really as we know them in terms of human biology or animal biology. But we were wondering whether you could make an embryo and then isolate stem cells from that embryo. And this was sort of really teasing sort of a dogma in biology at the time about whether cells are committed in their fate. So once they sort of develop and mature, whether they're kind of stuck in that pathway. We now know that, of course, they're not, but my work played a part of that. And I started it in the mid-90s, before Dolly the sheep, before Shinya Yamanaka, who I think you mentioned in the last episode, discovered induced pluripotent stem cells. But it really was a absolutely heady time to working in the field. So I did my PhD, lots of blood, sweat and tears, finally published my work. And even though I'd done a lot of work in public and in the public arena and always been really interested in ethics and the implications of what we do, always the one who wanted to kind of go out there, demystify, explain, maybe justify what we were doing in the lab in these sort of two quite controversial areas, because the kind of area I was working in at that stage was therapeutic cloning. And what I didn't realise, because I was working in mouse, was the reaction I would get. And when the work was published, it was sort of, covered extensively in the media, but both, I think, overhyped in terms of its significance and what it could do, but also overly denigrated around kind of this slippery slope and the fear that we were going to start cloning humans. So I was really interested in that. And this was sort of now in the early 2000s. And I was working in biotech. I sort of left finished my PhD, started working in biotech, and I was really concerned about the discourse. And I thought, I've got a few things to say about that. So even though I was just working as a science, sort of managing some science projects for this biotech company, they were also very encouraging that I should take a bit more of a public stance. And I represented the company in many different areas. And that was Stem Cell Sciences back in the day, one of the first stem cell companies. And that was a fantastic experience because I'd never really talked to politicians. I'd never really talked to the media or even met a bioethicist. So, yeah, that's sort of my background. I sort of started thinking, wow, we in the scientific community must step forward and have something to say about some of these issues. Maybe not the solution, but again, be part of this conversation. So I think, that's sort of where I come from. And then in the next sort of arc of my career, I've just done more and more work in academia and in community, trying to look more deeply at issues with colleagues who have a different lens, people who work and have a background in sociology or anthropology or bioethics or in law. And sort of collectively, we try to look at problems and maybe develop solutions. So a lot of my work is very kind of impact-driven. I'm really interested in doing the empirical work, doing some research, finding out what people think and perhaps how the law works, but how could it work better? And then trying to make some changes.
Amazing. There's so many interesting parts we could talk about there. One of the first ones I actually wanted to ask you about, because we get asked this question a lot, particularly around Dolly the sheep, because we're obviously producing cultivated lamb.
Well, you
products.
do have Lucy the lamb.
We do.
I was going to comment on that.
We do. Lucy's not a clone though, like Dolly. But a lot of people ask me about, it sounds like you're cloning a sheep with what you're doing, and I know you touched on therapeutic cloning there, and I'm not a scientist, so I don't specifically know what that term means. But can you talk a little bit about cloning, perhaps in a general sense, and around maybe Dolly the sheep and therapeutic cloning?
Yeah, sure. So really, the technology for therapeutic and reproductive cloning. So when we talk about Dolly the sheep, and I think there's There's Polly the sheep, and Matilda. There's a whole lot of names that are very inventive, but Dolly is the best name for many reasons. They're using the same technology as I was using for therapeutic cloning. So basically what we were doing was taking an egg and we were taking out the DNA, the nuclear material that allows sort of the inheritance from the mother, taking that out and substituting that with at the nucleus of a cell. So I was using cells from the ovary, but a lot of, I think Dolly is actually a fibroblast. And I think you got all sciencey last time and talked about fibroblasts, but they're a connective tissue cell. And you basically just want the DNA, you want the nucleus. And the whole concept in cloning, the whole kind of biology is to say an egg needs a driver. And if you take the nucleus, it can possibly be the driver of development. So you substitute it. And we use microsurgery. I use this really cool machine that allowed me to do that transfer, but you use very fine glass needles, or pipettes actually, and to do this kind of micro manipulation. And then you either use a chemical or maybe even a shock of electricity to jolt the egg into being activated. So basically you're mimicking egg-sperm fusion, like fertilization, but you're doing it using a nucleus. And some of those reconstituted eggs will develop into embryos, but not all. So if you think about Dolly, and we have over the decades got better with the technology, but Dolly was one of, I think, 277 reconstituted eggs. So terribly inefficient. And the real difference, so you make the embryo, and the real difference between reproductive cloning and then what I was doing in the lab, which was trying to take that embryo, make stem cells from it, is where it's happening. So if it's in the lab, it's therapeutic. If it's back into a uterus, you're attempting reproductive cloning. And it's what's interesting in the human context is because of the controversy, we had law introduced in Australia way back in 2002 that make it actually a criminal offence to attempt to clone a human through this technology. It does allow other uses of the technology and other uses of spare or donated IVF embryos. But it's it's a really interesting, I think, time in Australian discourse that there was this kind of conversation around should we do this? Is it appropriate? And if it's appropriate, under what circumstances? And they're the kind of questions I find really interesting.
So I'm going to jump in there and just one of the things, because I was around at the time, and one of the things that's sort of people didn't quite understand is the why we were doing or why that type of research was going on. And in my words, we were looking for ways to treat people with various diseases and injuries that didn't have a good option for them at that time. And we were looking for ways of providing cells for therapy that may not be rejected. So the pathway for therapeutic cloning would potentially produce identical cells for somebody that could be used to treat them that wouldn't be seen by that person's immune system. And I should also say, this is not the technology that we're using at Magic Valley. And
well, there's some interesting overlap there.
There is overlap, but and a lot of attention was paid to this technology prior to the announcement / discovery that Shinya Yamanaka and his team made that you could reprogram cells to make induced pluripotent stem cells without going through the somatic cell nuclear transfer or cloning procedure. So it's really interesting that the legislation that was put in place then was helping to cover, to some extent, technologies that didn't even exist when the legislation was put in place. And I think there's some parallels to be made about regulations that don't yet exist in this country around how cultivated meat is going to be looked after and where we're at in terms of labelling and legalities and ethics around that. I know there was a lot in that.
Yeah, I know there's so many things I want to respond, because I think that the first thing, going back to why, because I think that's what you should be asking. So for me, I think we talked about this, maybe you even mentioned in the introduction, but stem cells is often seen as, unethical. It's often controversial, unethical, or has ethical questions. And I've always resisted that, because I'm not saying that they are not, but they're context related. So we have to ask, in what context are we having this discussion, and what are we doing? Where do the cells come from? For what purpose? And I'm always really interested in people who donate their cells for research and making sure that we're using the material that they've donated consistently with their original intent, what they've signed the consent for. And we as researchers need to be super careful that we're not 20 years later using the original cells in a different context that hadn't been imagined. So, in my world, I was involved in one of the first licenses. So under the law I mentioned, if you want to use a human embryo in research, you have to apply for a license. You have to get ethics from your institution, but you have to get a license. And I was involved in the application for that. We were one of the first. It took longer to apply and get granted a license than it did for me to have and deliver my baby. So it was it was a very lengthy process, but perhaps it should have been, because this was really new technology. I was very concerned, even way back when I was doing my PhD, that how is that going to be equitable? I mean, where were those eggs going to come from? Who could afford to do that? So one of the things I was interested in, the justification I used when I argued for the law to be changed, way back in 2005, was that what if we could use this technology not necessarily as a transplantation route, but as a way of understanding what happens in disease. So someone with motor neuron disease, very hard to understand and study motor neurons and their function in the body. But what if we could replicate that in the lab? So that was always my justification, and we'd need much fewer. Terrible English. We would not need as many eggs to do that. So that was always my interest. So yeah. Anyway, I've gone off topic, Andy. But you mentioned so many other really interesting things, and I think you mentioned the law and regulation, which is certainly a question I was going to ask you guys. So I'm a bit, as you said, new to this field, and I was curious about how food is regulated in this context, and whether there's already. I know there's other companies who are working in this space, but is there kind of like a pathway to market?
So to get a new food into the market to be sold in Australia, you go through FSANZ, which stands for Food Standards Australia, New Zealand. They have a pathway called a novel food pathway, which is basically a 9 to 12 month process where they check everything about your new food product. And they may also tell you, it's not a new food product, it's actually the same as this, so therefore it is approved. So, but basically they'll check for allergenicity, they'll check for the process, they'll check for all the safety aspects and also comment on the labelling aspects. And it's all under food legislation that is present, already existing, and has been for close to 100 years in Australian legislation, and in a number of different food safety aspects in that. And once you get through a product gets regulated through nationally or internationally, actually, because it's Australia and New Zealand, you then start production. If it's meat, you get an approval from your local council for your facility, and then the state that you're in, there are different. In each state, there's a different organisation that looks after the regulation around meat production and sale. So there's definitely a lot of legislation and safety checks around the production of and release of new foods in Australia. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, and I think there's a pathway there, but has anyone tried to navigate it yet?
There are people, to our understanding, there are companies navigating that as we speak. We've been in contact both in my previous job, and I know Paul, together with Paul, actually been at my previous role at the CSIRO, where we've been consulting with and consulting to some extent, the Food Standards Australia, New Zealand for over 2 years. Specifically around the processes that we're developing.
Yeah, and that's obviously different across countries as well. And obviously, as you mentioned before, this is quite new. This technology hasn't been used to create products for human consumption. And so a lot of the regulations are still developing in those countries. Hopefully there'll be some uniformity, country to country in terms of the process. But that's still all to play out, really.
Yeah, and I think, we see the same thing in the human field, that these emerging technologies, they really are trailblazers, or you have to have trailblazers, I suppose, to navigate these regulations. And again, this sort of open discourse with the regulators, because I think to them it'll be very new as well, and continuing to demystify the science and to be looking at these issues of safety. I was, you mentioned people worrying or perhaps concerned that the product is from cloning, from a cloned Lucy, Lucy the lamb. What other kind of, so I was going to ask you, Paul, around, particularly because of your background, I've noticed that you're quite careful to use cultured meat, I think, as how you describe your product. But I wondered whether there was resistance about using, using other nomenclature, using other names for your product. And have you done, I know you did some polling around Magic Valley, but did you do some polling around, people's perhaps ick factor or yuck factor around names?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Our preferred term is cultivated meat.
Cultivate. Oh, sorry.
That's okay. We haven't done our own personal surveying around terminology, but there has been some industry-wide surveys done extensively, and one that came out last year, or might have come out the previous year actually. I think which was run by the Good Food Institute. Came up with cultivated being the preferred term, and we actually signed up to a memorandum of understanding, particularly in the APAC region, with a number of other companies to adopt cultivated because it was the preferred description for what we're doing. So cultivated meat. Not everyone has signed up to that. Some people still use cultured. When I'm having conversations with people who've never heard about what we're doing before, I'll say cultivated and they don't know what I'm talking about. I'll say cultured, they still don't know what I'm talking about. I say lab grown and then they understand.
Yes.
And so, when I'm having individual conversations with people, being the most descriptive term, lab grown, people tend to understand that. The media tend to use lab grown a lot still because I think for that very reason. I'm sure even some of the articles that we've appeared in, the heading will be cultivated originally, but then, after a few hours, it's lab grown because obviously they're running some A/B testing to see which people click through more on. But in terms of us using cultivated, that's the preferred term that we've seen from those consumer surveys, and which we've decided to adopt going forward. Yeah,
that's really interesting. And I did see some of the other terms like artificial and we have the same problem in the human world where there was a discovery made a year or so ago around artificial embryos and what that means, and we make sort of organ-grown hearts and what do we call them and things like that. So it's just nomenclature and what we call these things I think is so interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, there's particularly in Australia, there has been some inquiries around product labelling, particularly in the plant-based and cultivated space. And, I think people that are probably not as keen to see cultivated meat come to market try and use, some of those terms, like synthetic, like lab grown, even the more disparaging terms around, Franken meat and all those sorts of things. But, the general public sort of, doesn't really buy into that. They just want to understand, have clear transparency around, the products, the labelling and what they're consuming, and particularly the process, which I think is the most important as opposed to the name.
Yeah, gosh, I hadn't even thought about who the opponents were in these discussions. And of course, there's a big community with a vested interest not to see these products get to market. Yeah,
we're going off on a bit of a tangent here, but yeah, look, there's definitely an embedded industry in terms of meat products or any animal derived products for that matter. Look, we have different. We get different responses from within the industry. A lot of people within the industry are just opposed to it, just straight out opposed. Obviously, we could be seen, as a threat in commercial terms, to the viability of their business, etc. And then we get the exact opposite as well. We get people that are within the industry that are really interested in what we're doing. They're interested in the technology. They want to know how they can adopt it in their business. Is that going to be viable for them to do? So it's been a really mixed response so far, and I'm sure it will continue to be into the future. So
we're getting some really interesting approaches from people in that industry that are interested in a more reliable supply chain. And we're not there yet, but that's where we're aiming to be. And so that's not something I'd even thought about, that weather and disease really can affect supply chain in the meat industry. Whereas if it's all being grown in a factory in a sterile way, then it's much less likely to be unpredictable.
So I had a question following on from that then. And obviously lamb is on the menu straight up. What about other species? Are you thinking about applying a similar technology using, again, IPSCs and then differentiating? And I had a question again for you around science. I think you're differentiating the stem cells, you're growing them into muscle, obviously, but also fat. Is that right? And other cell types as well, or just those? Or can't you tell me? Is it top secret?
No, it's absolutely. So to answer your first question, we're not thinking about other species. We've already done other species. So we have a new species going to be announced very, very soon. I'm not going to say what it is, or did we already say what it is? In the last
I think I've probably told a million people, but
oh, please
it's
tell
a secret
me.
now. No,
Tell me and my friends.
Yeah, so we have a pork prototype coming up very soon. And
can I name it?
We're from a marketing perspective, we're sort of trying to move away a little bit from that. I think it's
identification with the one animal.
Yeah, exactly. and we are working on a plan for our bovine prototype for later in the year. So,
and as, again, wearing my scientist hat, are you finding growing different species different? Because what I think is really interesting about your approach is that you are not using you're not using animal products in your culture media. I know there was a big conversation last time about media. So culture media. Is it as easy as you're expecting to shift the factory or the bioreactor from one species to another?
No, it's not simple. It doesn't mean we can't do it. We need to adjust our media for each species. Makes it harder not having any animal products because the recipes and the scientific publications that are out there all use animal products in their differentiation strategies. But yeah, we are pretty happy with where we've got to so far with the lamb and the pork species that we've started with. And don't think I answered your previous question, but we are absolutely differentiating to muscle, to fat, looking at connective tissue, and looking at other food-related differentiations as well.
Wow, it's very interesting. So, again, sorry, Paul, one last science question. 3D printing. If you've got all those different cell types, can you do 3D printing, or is that just way too far in the future?
It's not too far in the future. It's absolutely possible right now. We don't think it's the right commercial way to go in terms of the cost and in terms of where we want to head in our first directions. In terms of in our longer term projections, we're looking at different ways of making more structured products from the different species. But 3D printing is somewhat slow and somewhat expensive.
Yeah, I can imagine that. I was just thinking texture. That's sort of when I think of meat and I look at your lovely images on your website, I can certainly see the substitution for a burger, and the tacos look fabulous. But yeah, I was just thinking about texture in other contexts. But I had a twinkle in my eye when you were saying that, because I was thinking, whoa, what about organoids?
Yeah,
Sorry.
I mean, it's that understanding of that technology and the space I've come from in terms of previous cell culture work and how you take a two-dimensional cell culture and make it into three-dimensional and then expand that. So just from an engineering perspective, a three-dimensional suspension culture is much more energy and nutrient and less expensive. It's a much better way to go. And organoid is a term that's used in research, which basically means a ball of cells growing in a suspension culture.
And it can have a little bit of structural difference and mimicking a little bit more the original organ.
Exactly, yeah.
It's interesting you mentioned 3D printing, because there are companies, particularly in the plant-based space as well as cultivated meat space, that are using 3D printing already. But as Andrew mentioned, we think at scale that's not going to be the most effective approach to take. But you certainly can. It's just a little bit expensive and slow.
But very eye-catching.
It does look great, yeah.
See, I haven't seen the plant products, and the ones I have seen at the supermarket just look like they've been screen printed, but so I hadn't worked out that the perhaps 3D printing was an option, but that's
absolutely. I don't think any of the 3D printed products are available for sale. I think that's everyone still doing R&D, and like Andrew said, like they look great. But is that commercially viable to do that? Probably not at this stage.
We talked a little bit before about the source of serum, and that you don't use fetal bovine serum in your cultures. Again, possibly from a consumer perspective, having the reassurance that it's not using animal product you're not using animal product in your cultures, but you're also not using a source that perhaps is problematic for some people. The question around pluripotent sources, though, if I wear my sort of alternate hat, is that stability. And so, you were talking before, Andrew, around the fact that what you're trying to do is really challenging in terms of the fact it hasn't been published before. You're kind of, again, a real trailblazer in paving and getting the right recipe that's really reliable. And we know that culturing pluripotent stem cells is very sensitive. If you don't get the recipe right, the chromosomal, the integrity of the cells can be compromised. Is that something that concerns you? So, would the adult stem cell people say that their product's going to be more stable? Do you check it or anything?
This is really interesting because there's been a lot of debate about this online recently. And I would argue that we know far more about pluripotent stem cell stability in culture over long periods of time than we do about adult stem cells over long periods of time in culture, because they last longer in culture and because of the real potential in using human pluripotent stem cell derived cell types to treat diseases and injuries by actually injecting cells into people that are going to stay alive. You have to be absolutely certain that they're exactly the cell type that you want. There's some really fascinating threads on both Twitter and LinkedIn. Elliot Schwartz from the Good Food Institute has actually responded to an article in Bloomberg which was talking about this exact topic. And he said, when you think about it, because we're talking about food, so when you eat these products, they're going to be cooked and you're going to be eating them, and then they're going to go into your stomach where they're going to be broken up by the acids and enzymes in your stomach. So even if they had a chromosomal aberration, there is no danger to humans in eating that product. But obviously, from a perspective of a continued process where you're producing the cells, you don't want the cells to change. You want to monitor the cells to stay
back to
exactly
your product consistency.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I was really interested, again, you touched on the previous episode around GMO and the fact that I think some people might be concerned that you're using genetic modification in preparing your cells because, of course, in the very early days of this technology, that's what happened. But like in human work, we're getting better at controlling and harnessing the potential of these stem cells, these pluripotent stem cells, so we don't have to use genetic modification.
Exactly. Yeah, no, and it's also, and I think we could probably repeat this point in every podcast, that every person on the planet is eating DNA every day. Mm-hmm. Anyone who eats is eating DNA because that's in every cell of a plant or an animal contains DNA. So it's not dangerous to eat DNA. I don't know. There's a slight side point from what you're saying, but I think that's something that the elements of the general public get scared about.
Well, I think we've seen that so much in the GMO debate already. And again, I think you mentioned it earlier, Paul, around transparency. You want to be able to say clearly what your product is and what it hasn't relied upon. And I think that makes a difference to consumers.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that transparency piece is huge. I think a lot of people don't know where their food comes from today, particularly their animal products, or they choose not to think about it. Or they don't actually know because, you can't see footage inside slaughterhouses and all those sorts of things. That's a whole another topic, which we might touch on later. But, I think particularly with the new food product, that transparency is super important. And, I mean, the whole GMO aspect, we're non-GMO. Our process is non-GMO. I think the consumer perception, as you mentioned, of GMO is still quite negative and probably will be for quite some time. Whether that's justified or not, it's sort of not up to me to say, but the perception of it is really strong, particularly when it comes to food products. And yeah, look, that might change in the future. But for us, it's important, to make sure everyone knows we don't use FBS, we don't use, other animal components. There's no animal slaughter involved. The products are not GMO. And I think that makes a difference to the consumer.
I'm just going to jump in there because a couple of people told me after our last podcast that we didn't define GMO. So GMO is a genetically modified organism. So at its simplest level, that means the DNA has been changed in a cell or an animal. So that's not the process that we're using. DNA has been deliberately changed in a cell or an animal.
So in science and research, we often even add in, say, a marker, so a fluorescent, some DNA that would make and code for like a fluorescent glow when the cells are under a particular light. So it has a huge application in research, genetic modification, and I think some would argue in agriculture. But as Paul mentions, it's also an area that's really contentious, and whether it's why that's the case, I think, is probably a too big a challenge for you and your company. But I think, again, being clear what you do and what you don't do and what technologies you rely on, I think is really, really important.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's probably a good segue into talking about animal agriculture a little bit more, and also veganism as well, which is I'm a bit more qualified to talk about than the science aspect. But there's definitely, and I'll just make this very clear from the start. I've been vegan for about 9 years now, so full disclosure. But I certainly don't, speak on behalf of all vegans or the vegan community or pretend to. But there are definitely differing views within the vegan community, particularly about, cultivated meat and the potential for it to, reduce or eliminate animal suffering. And everyone, has a different opinion. Everyone's personal food choices are their own personal choices. But I thought it might be useful for me to actually read out the definition of veganism from the Vegan Society, and we can maybe chat a little bit about that. But our products are real animal products. They are real animal products. So by definition, they're meat. But the definition of veganism is a philosophy and way of living which seeks to exclude, as far as is possible and practical, all forms of exploitation of and cruelty to animals for food, clothing, or any other purpose, and by extension promotes the development and use of animal-free alternatives for the benefit of animals, humans, and the environment. In dietary terms, it denotes the practice of dispensing with all products derived wholly or partly from animals. So in relation to that definition, clearly cultivated meat, which we've said is real meat, is not vegan and would not be considered vegan. But I guess when we're talking about a practical approach to having consumers do away with animal products, within their lives and within their diets. And as the definition, mentions around exploitation of and cruelty to animals as being a major part of it, where does cultivated meat sit now? Because obviously, as we've described the process, our animal involvement is an initial skin scraping from the animal. And if you think, animals, even if we talk about farmed animals that, have much more invasive procedures done to them, animals that are going to end up being consumed for food. We mentioned before about the insemination of cows and those sorts of things. But even, people that have pets at home, you take them to the vet, they get an injection, vaccination, or, all those sorts of things. I mean, this is a very grey area. I mean, there's certainly no black and white, but, we could extrapolate that further into, your cats at home, do they want to be living in your apartment with you? Are they doing that voluntarily? Is there consent there? Are you exploiting the animal? Same with your dogs. And, it's a very, very grey area. But I guess in terms of, my perspective around wanting to develop, cultivated meat products, if we have a look at, as everyone has said, and I've mentioned before, people are like, why don't you start a plant-based business? What about the plant-based market, et cetera, et cetera? Well, we know, from 2019, it's around 2% of the population is vegan. As of today, it's still 2%. So, plant-based products are not having any sort of impact there. We know people want to eat meat. If we know that 98% of the population wants to eat meat, is there a more ethical way of doing it? Well, to me, cultivated meat is the obvious answer to that. We're just taking, an initial scraping of cells, as I mentioned, to create the products. Now, some people will argue that's exploitation.
Yep.
And I understand where they're coming from. And people have said that to me, that, even just taking those cells, there's no consent and that's exploitation of the animal. I think that's a very black and white view of it, because if you think about the alternative, if we can create cultivated meat products from that skin sampling, which we know we can turn into a master cell bank, we never have to interfere with the animal again. The animal's not harmed, certainly not slaughtered. And we compare that to the animal agriculture process today. And if we're talking about lamb or sheep, for example, they're slaughtered an average of 6 months of age. They're just babies. And we're slaughtering billions of them every year. Now, I think it's very difficult, if you look at that logically and pragmatically, how you could argue that a small skin scraping has any comparison to what is currently going on. And that's the viewpoint that I would take with it. I understand where other people are coming from, though, when they talk about, it being black and white, and, you should never interfere with an animal and, all those sorts of things. But we've got the pet example. There's a lot more examples as well around, very grey areas. If you were to purchase a vegan product from a company that also produces animal-derived products or meat products, are you then supporting that company and contributing to the additional animal potentially slaughter involved with those products? Do you shop at a general supermarket, where that occurs? You buy the vegan products, but the profits obviously go to the company that is potentially involved in animal agriculture. I could go on and on and on here with the greyness, but there's also a lot of talk around, when we're talking about veganism, there's a lot of talk around, particularly up in Queensland, around some organisations that are, animal sanctuaries or animal hospitals, or I'm trying to think of a way to describe an aquatic centre on the Gold Coast, where, these organisations do, a lot of great work. They will rescue, a lot of animals, they'll rescue a lot of wildlife, but they're not charity organisations and they need money to keep going as well. Some of those organisations breed animals in captivity and then use them for entertainment, for human entertainment. And part of the money from, that entertainment goes towards some of the rehabilitation work that they do. Where is the line there? There's definitely an animal hospital that I know of that does amazing wildlife rescue and rehabilitation, but they still need to operate. They still need to generate revenue somehow. Should they be able to or allowed to, utilise some of the animals that they've rescued for people to come and see and learn more about and donate to the hospital? Does it become a different scenario if they purchased animals to come into the sanctuary and use those animals to so it's very, very grey. I know a lot of people like to be black and white with their veganism, but it's just not black and white. The world is grey. Anyway, I feel like I'm going on a bit of a sermon there, but just in terms of veganism, everyone has a different perspective, and like I said, I don't pretend to speak for all vegans or everyone in the community, but I guess where I'm coming from, even vegans and particularly people in the the animal rights space, hear about cultivated meat and they're not interested, and that's fine. There are companies in the space that have been founded by vegans and run by vegans and animal activists, and there are companies that are not, which are purely profit-driven companies, as opposed to mission-driven. And again, it becomes similar to the Henry Ford quote about technology and automobiles, doing more for horses than animal rights activists ever did. Certainly wasn't Henry Ford's intention to save animals, but does it matter? Does it matter that was his intention? Because horses would be a lot better off since the advent of the automobile. And are his intentions important? Does it matter if it's a large food conglomerate that commercializes all cultivated meat and has this impact for animals? Does that matter?
Yeah, and I think there's already moves afoot for some of the really large organisations that control a lot of meat sales around the world that are already investing in cultivated meat in different areas. That it's and one of the other, just to make your next comment super complicated, Megan, one of the other aspects to it is that I've lost my train of thought now. I'm going to throw it to you, Megan.
Well, it's fascinating. So I don't think it was a sermon at all. I think it's a really important comment, and I think your role in the company is fascinating. That you're a committed vegan yet doing this. And I think you're driven by impact. You're driven by wanting to see as much change as you can. You've seen what hasn't worked.
Yep.
And, I think this idea of reaching people in the community who are the conscientious omnivores, so people who want to still eat meat, but like me, feel really very pleased that it's all packaged and I don't have to see any of that. I could just turn a blind eye. So I think it exposes an opportunity for people to make a choice.
Yeah.
And a choice that they'd be more comfortable with. And, the texture and the taste and all of those things, I think are a secondary issue because at the moment you have very few choices. So I think, it's a challenging area, and I'm sure you'll be criticised by people who don't want to see any harm or a meat product, because I suppose the flip argument would be that's normalising the continual practice of eating meat. So, one bigger question I was going to ask you guys was, we in medicine and our sort of aspirations around stem cell based medicines, there's a lot of conversation that I'm sure Andy's been part of over the decades around equitable access.
Yeah, that's where I was trying to go before.
Yeah, and so we call it like needle tip to needle tip, and that works very well in metropolitan Melbourne, because we'll have in our imaginary future, a beautiful facility at the Royal Children's Hospital that's dedicated to helping children and their families access cellular therapies. But it may not be so great if you live in Mildura or if you live in the Northern Territory. So how do we balance that? And I think it's a little bit similar here, that I can see your product in my Hampton Woolworths, but is it going to be making enough of an impact to change the practices? I think on your website you talk about, I'm just trying to remember the number, how many, it was 10 billion people, I think, by 2050, right? But even using that kind of framing, is it realistic to think your product will have that impact? I mean, I think it's going to have more impact than the faken. Is that the right phrase? The fake bacon?
That's a brand.
Is it? Sorry, is it? Sorry.
No, that's all right.
But it's a plant-based, isn't it? I think.
Yeah.
But I've seen that in the supermarket, and there's that kind of option, and it doesn't really appeal to me, but perhaps another would. So I'm just, I think that it's the impact of where you're headed. And, it's going to be really interesting to see your reception from both the people who are opposing it, so this activist community, but also the regulators. I think, how they see, as we started the conversation, how they see the product and some of the safety issues.
Yeah, look, absolutely. And I think when we're talking about particularly, pure veganism, we can talk about, which has been very topical lately, and this is going to take us in a whole other area, but, vaccines, medicines, they're all tested on animals, whether we like that or not.
And then people.
Exactly. So, it's just a very, very grey area. So I don't think you can take, a pure stance. That's not to say there aren't people in that space that are supportive. Most of them are. Most of the people I've spoken to, but there's certainly people that aren't.
And I think, again, something you probably don't talk about enough is conscientious objection. Just because there's choice doesn't mean you have to.
Great point.
Yep.
That's a super point because, I'm certainly, not telling all the vegans and vegetarians out there that they have to eat cultivated meat. I absolutely am not saying that whatsoever. It's a choice. And it's really the products we're designing are designed for meat eaters, people that want to eat meat, that may have concerns around the ethics of it, the sustainability of it, the health of the product. This is who this product is designed for. So I'm certainly not out here telling all the vegans that they need to eat cultivated meat and it's fine and it's vegan. I'm definitely not saying that. I'm not even saying you have to support us. What I'm saying is just be open to what we're trying to do here and the impact that it can potentially have, rather than just being closed off to it straight away. Just let's have a conversation around it. Let's just talk about it
and at least understand what it is.
Exactly.
And so you've talked a lot about the vegan community, but what about the vegetarian community?
Yeah, that's a good one. I might handball it to Andrew, given he's vegetarian. But
I don't even know that I've been. If I've been vegetarian
I believe I went
for
to your
about 9
birthday
years.
party where there was some beautiful vegetarian catering.
Yes. Actually, I think that was vegan.
Oh, was it vegan? Oh, well, it was delicious.
Yeah. So, I mean, just like Paul's saying, he doesn't at all represent the vegan community's views. I definitely do not represent the vegetarian community's views, and I know there are many different types of vegetarian, different religious backgrounds, health perspectives. You just, not that I've been on an airplane for a long time, but you can just see when you order your meal, there's 6 or 7 different types of vegetarian meal that you can pre-order. So I don't think there is a vegetarian perspective per se, but from a health perspective, I think, which is why I'm vegetarian, I'm probably still not going to eat that many meat products down the track, but I'm really quite happy to try these, and from my what drives me perspective, it's in doing this job, it's helping remove some animals from the food chain, or as many as possible from the food chain, but it's also what's better for the planet in terms of carbon sequestration, in terms of the amount of land that's available to be revegetated that isn't set aside just for feeding livestock.
They're pretty strong motivators, Andrew.
Absolutely. So, yeah, I think, and going back to the question about equitable access to the technology, we talk to a lot of people in the industry who don't really think about ethics. And what they say is, as long as you can get it cheaper and it tastes as good or better, you're laughing. And I think about it, and when I think about it and what we're doing and what I'd love to see one day is a large burger chain where we replaced the meat from a large burger chain, that the burger would taste absolutely identical, and that we could produce it more reliably and more safely, and that you could potentially plant back half the Brazilian rainforest because it's been chopped down to make space for animal livestock. To me, that's a no-brainer.
Yeah.
That we're heading the right way.
Well, look, it's interesting that you raise commercial forces. It's certainly something that I've seen a lot in the stem cell space. So I've talked a little bit about my interest in seeing stem cell-based therapeutics get to clinic. And of course, I've been talking about that for 20 years, what we hope one day we'll do. And I do think it's a generational change issue. It's not going to be overnight. It's going to be for our children or even their children's children, and not necessarily for everyone. We may not have a solution for everything. But while we've been talking and working and trying to harness the potential of these cells, clinics, companies have opened up saying, we can do it already. We can do it already. And they may not all be driven purely by sale. They might think that they're helping people. But I think it's a similar thing here. Unfortunately, market forces are so strong that comment you made, Andrew, around if its taste is good and it's cheaper, that's, I think, a truism. I think that's what will happen. But wouldn't it be nice to think of a world where something else also is considered? And I think, again, at a generational level, we're seeing the next generation who are really thinking about these things. They're thinking about their future. They're thinking about the impact on the planet, and they want change and they want options. So, that hopefully cultivated meat, because I've learned a new phrase today, even though I'd read the website, obviously I missed that bit. But cultivated meat could play into that. And I think, again, it's about choice. And your comment about whether you're vegan or vegetarian or an omnivore, you want to be able to exercise your rights, I suppose. And you can only do that for something on the, let's be frank, on the supermarket shelf, because we can't all go to farmers market or grow our in the backyard.
Yeah, we're not all privileged enough to only get meat that comes from a beautifully landscaped regenerative farming, not medicine, regenerative agriculture facility that is really looking after their animals and organic. And there's simply not enough room on the planet to be able to feed the population, to be able for everybody to do that. So that's by its definition is a very hierarchical way of providing food to the population.
Absolutely. Is there anything else you want to ask Megan today, Andrew?
I don't think I do, other than have you got time for a coffee and a snack afterwards?
Is it meat, Andrew?
And not for me, it won't be.
No, I can go vegan. No, I think, look, it's been absolutely fabulous, and thanks for answering some of my questions, because I was really curious, and I knew from Twitter that Andrew, I haven't seen Andrew for a few years because of lockdown, and I knew you'd left CSIRO, and I knew you were working in the new company, and I knew it was something about replacement meats, but I didn't know much about it. And it's been absolutely fascinating listening to your other podcasts, but also, talking today about some of these really great issues you're thinking about, and, trying to bring people along with you. I think it's great. All power to you.
Thanks, Megan. Yeah, look, it's a really complex topic, and there's so many different areas to consider. And I think your insights have been super valuable today. So thank you so much for coming in today.
Pleasure.
I think that'll be a good time for us to wrap up this episode.
Just before we do, I'd encourage people, if you just caught this episode because of the wide-ranging network of Professor Megan Munsie, please feel free to go back and listen to our first couple of episodes, and also check out our socials, Instagram, Twitter, we're on LinkedIn, we're on TikTok, and I always forget one. Which one have I forgotten this time? Facebook. Yeah, we're also on Facebook. So.
And if I could put in a plug and just say, if anyone's curious about stem cells, and I haven't explained fully today some of the terms I've used, or you've thought about stem cells but you want to know more, and then this is in the context of human, I might need to add a page, Andrew, about meat. But we have a portal at the university, a website called Stem Cells Australia, and there's lots of mostly information around medical applications, but there's some basic science facts there as well. And we'd be delighted to have you visit and ask any questions through the contact us page. So thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Megan.